The rain had been pecking the window panes all evening, soft and steady, like fingers asking to be let in. I was walking back from the hallway bathroom, passing the oak door to my father's office, when I heard my name and stopped. The door sat open an inch enough for light to cut a thin golden line across the carpet. I heard Alexandra's laugh, a bright bell I knew by heart, then my father's voice, low and certain, the voice he used to close deals. "Your sister," he said, as if weighing a piece of scrap lumber. "She doesn't deserve a dime. She's out." My hand went cold around the doorknob, colder than the brass itself. Through that narrow slice, I saw my father at his desk, papers in neat stacks. Alexandra angled on the leather sofa, my mother standing at the window, the way she did when she wanted the world to be her mirror. Something in my breath made a sound, and Eleanor turned, found my eyes in that slit of light, and smiled. It was small and knowing, the kind of smile you give a clerk when your card clears. Not surprise, not regret, just confirmation. The smell of coffee and roast thyme drifted from the kitchen, friendly as old neighbors. In the office, numbers shuffled, voices lowered, a future arranged around a table I was not invited to sit at. I stepped backward until the light wasn't on me anymore. Somewhere, a clock ticked. Somewhere, a drawer closed. Inside my ribs, something quiet snapped clean as a dry twig. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from, down in the comments. And if you've ever stood on the other side of a family door and heard your worth decided without you tap the like button, and share this with someone who will understand. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. To understand how that one sentence changed the shape of my life, you have to see the house it lived in. Our colonial in the West Hills had the manners of a postcard: white trim, symmetrical windows, a porch light that came on at dusk like a habit. Inside, everything had a place and a purpose, or at least a pose. Eleanor's crystal bowls never held fruit. The antique settee in the living room could bruise your shins if you tried to sit like a person who breathes. This was a house that looked the part, and we learned early that looking the part earns applause. I learned different lessons too, but they came across town in my grandmother Martha's small craftsman. Her table was oak-nicked and honest, always warm under your wrists. She'd slide my savings account statements across to me with her reading glasses low on her nose, and she'd talk about compound interest like it was a good neighbor who always brought back what it borrowed. "You pay yourself first," she'd say, tapping the line where the numbers climbed. "Then you can afford to be generous." At home, generosity ran one way. If Alexandra had a recital, there were flowers on the passenger seat and a dinner reservation waiting. If I won the state math championship, my mother wrote a note to my teacher saying how proud she was that I could do numbers so well, and asked if the auditorium lighting might be kinder to Alexandra's complexion at the spring concert. My father loved a success he could point to from a podium. Alexandra's sketches were laid out at parties like proofs of destiny. My grades were filed like receipts. I left for college with a suitcase, a scholarship, and $15,000 my grandmother had tucked into a dedicated account for your future, not anyone else's. In Chicago, I measured life in rent checks and bus schedules and budgets that balanced because I made them balance. I learned how to stretch a dollar without wringing it dry. I sent money home every month when my father said the business was in a slow patch. I told myself it was respect that I was contributing to the roof that once covered me. That kind of lie feels noble until you hear what people say when they think you're not there. Michael noticed before I did that my body folded when my parents called. He'd stand at the counter, drying a pan, and watch the way my shoulders climbed toward my ears. "You make yourself small when you talk to them," he said one night, gentle the way he is. "You don't have to." I believed him in the kitchen. It was harder at the dining room table I grew up at, where the napkins stood like white sails, and I was always a little seasick. Thanksgiving brought me home in a raincoat and careful hope. I wore a ring I loved for what it meant, not what it cost, a lab stone with a clean, honest shine. My mother lifted my hand, praised the tastefulness, mentioned minimalism, as if she had invented restraint. My father kissed my cheek and called me prodigal because it let him be magnanimous. The house smelled like citrus cleaner and rosemary. The refrigerator hummed. My old bedroom was now the guest room beige and hotel calm, the wall where my medals once hung, wearing a generic landscape of a lake no one could name. At dinner, Alexandra entered on her own cue wearing a dress of her design, black and architectural, the room adjusting to her the way rooms will when someone believes they deserve it. She brought a boyfriend with venture capital teeth. James sat him at the head's right and fed him questions like steaks. I tried to offer a thought on succession planning and was patted away with a dessert fork. We have excellent advisors, my father said, as if facts were impositions and love was brand management. When coffee came, I excused myself and drifted the same old hallway. That was when the office door gave me a sliver and a sentence. She doesn't deserve a dime. She's out. It landed not like a surprise, but like the shape of a bruise you've been pressing a thumb to for years. The pain is old, but now it has a name. Back in the guest room, the lamp threw a circle of butter-yellow light across the bedspread. I sat in it and put both feet on the floor, the way you do when the room is moving and you need to be still. My hands shook and then stopped. The house creaked, settling, shifting, reminding itself where the weight lives. I could hear the dishwasher start a soft rush, a promise to make things look clean again. I thought of the transfers I'd made into the family account because there had been a slow patch. I thought of the hours I waited tables at college because the scholarship covered tuition but not laundry quarters. I remembered the envelopes my grandmother labeled in her neat hand, the way she underlined my name once, like she was tying a ribbon. I thought of all the times my mother had called me independent, as if it were a flaw and a favor. Outside, rain stitched the darkness to the glass. The house across the street flicked on a porch light, and I could see the shape of a neighbor stepping out to bring in a package before it got wet. It was a small scene, ordinary and decent. It made me ache. In the mirror above the dresser, I saw a woman with damp hair and steady eyes. Independence had been the story they told about me. It was also the muscle I'd been building when no one clapped. In the morning, my father had announced there would be a family meeting about legacy. The word had always rolled around this house like a loose coin. It made a good sound. It bought things you could photograph. It did not often pay what was owed. I pictured the legal pads on his desk, the paper clips lined like soldiers, the trust documents with polished language. There are ways to write someone out so their absence reads like fine print. There are also numbers that do not care who smiles at a window. I stood and opened the guest closet. My suitcase sat on the shelf like a thought I hadn't decided to have yet. I ran my hand along the zipper and let it be. On the desk, my laptop glowed to life with a soft chime, the light blue as early morning. Habit took my fingers where they always go. Statements, transfers, authorizations, the tidy archive of a daughter who saves everything because she learned that forgetting is the fastest way to be erased. I stopped. This was the hour for feeling the cut, not stitching it shut with tasks. The injustice wasn't only the sentence through the door. It was the history that made the sentence possible, the training that taught everyone in that room I would accept it because I always had. I closed the laptop and listened to my breath. In, out, in again. Quiet dignity has a sound. It doesn't need permission. Down the hall, the grandfather clock chimed 9, then 10. Voices rose and fell. Laughter threaded through like string. In the kitchen, a drawer thumped closed, and Eleanor's bracelets made their bright little clatter. I pictured the seating chart for the next day's meeting in my father's careful hand. Head of table, right hand, left hand, and then the margin where I'd been penciled out. Not a daughter, but a contingency they had decided they no longer needed. I thought about Michael's hands warming a ceramic mug back in Chicago. The way he looks at a blueprint, measuring loads and spans, trusting that truth belongs to what holds. There are loads you can't see until the beam bows. There are spans that look elegant on paper and fail in weather. My family liked facades. I had spent my life building the structure behind it. The rain eased to a hush. My eyes burned, but the tears didn't come. Not then. I felt something steadier take their place, like a level settling its bubble. If a door is the problem, a door can also be the solution. You can close it. You can open it and walk through. You can put your hand on the wood and decide it no longer gets to decide you. I turned off the lamp and lay on the bed with my ring hand on my stomach, feeling the slow tide of breath. From somewhere deep in the house came the muffled click of the office lock turning. Papers would be stacked now, pens capped. The future tucked into folders ready to be presented like a foregone conclusion. My phone buzzed with a message from Michael. Nothing grand, just, "How's your heart?" I stared at the words until they blurred, then typed back. "Learning." The screen went black. The room exhaled with me. In the morning, there would be coffee in thick white mugs and the scrape of chair legs on the hardwood. There would be the word legacy again, and someone would fold their napkin too precisely. There would be numbers finally, and all the room's oxygen would swing to face them. I would be there in the place I have always been, set slightly off to the side, where a person can be useful and overlooked in the same breath. But not in the same way. Not anymore. I closed my eyes and let the rain finish its last light tapping on the glass. Somewhere inside the walls, the house adjusted a quiet shiver along joists I knew by feel. When I slept, it wasn't deep. It was enough. And just before sleep let go, a thought arrived with the tidiness of a ledger line. If I could hear the sentence that wrote me out, I could write my own line back in. Morning would come. A table would be set. A reckoning would wear the shape of breakfast and paper. And I would sit down in a chair that suddenly belonged to me. The morning began with the smell of coffee and the steady whisper of rain on the windows. I had barely slept, though I must have closed my eyes for an hour or two because the light had changed. The house was quiet, in that particular way that comes after something has already broken, but before anyone admits it. I moved through the hallway on careful feet, feeling the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath the rug. In the dining room, the table was already set for breakfast. China gleamed under the chandelier. Everything looked the same, which somehow made it worse. My father was the first to appear. His tie already knotted, his voice brisk. He poured coffee into his favorite mug, the one with the company logo, and didn't notice that my suitcase stood by the front door. "You're up early," he said, as though we hadn't both been awake half the night thinking about different truths. "Couldn't sleep," I answered. My voice sounded even to my own ears, practiced calm built over years of meetings and deadlines. He nodded, misreading the steadiness for peace. "You'll feel better after breakfast. We've got a family discussion this morning. Some long-term planning." The words landed like a script he'd already rehearsed. I watched the steam curl from his cup and wondered how many times he'd gone over what he planned to say, never imagining that I already knew. My mother entered next, perfume preceding her a subtle cloud of lilies and something sharper underneath. Her pearls sat perfectly against the collar of her sweater. She smiled at me like a hostess greeting a polite guest. "Deirdre, sweetheart, you look pale. Coffee?" She poured without waiting for an answer. Her tone was light, but her eyes flicked toward my father, questioning if he'd said too much already. I sat down across from them, folding my hands to keep them still. The warmth of the cup grounded me, though it did nothing for the chill in my chest. "Is Alexandra joining us?" I asked. "She'll be down soon," my father said. We have a few things to go over before she and Travis head out later. The mention of her boyfriend felt like another prop in their stage play, a distraction from the truth still hanging unspoken between us. I let the silence stretch, watched them both reach for toast they didn't want, pretending appetite where none existed. When Alexandra finally arrived, she looked as though she'd walked out of a magazine spread, hair brushed to shine, voice soft with sleep. She blinked at the three of us seated around the table, sensing tension, but not yet its shape. "What's going on?" she asked. "Sit down," I said. My voice surprised me, steady, low, certain. I'd heard myself speak that way in boardrooms, never in this house. They all looked at me, then the family circle, complete in its imbalance. I reached into my laptop bag and set 3 folders on the table, one before each of them. The movement was quiet, deliberate. My father's expression shifted. He recognized paperwork the way others recognize danger. "Last night I overheard a conversation in your office," I said, "about the inheritance plan." My mother's hand froze halfway to her cup. My father's jaw tightened. Alexandra looked from one to the other, confused. "That was a private discussion," my father said, his voice like gravel underfoot. "Yes," I said, "and in that private discussion you said, 'Your sister doesn't deserve a dime. She's out.'" The silence that followed was almost physical, thick enough to hear the clock ticking above the mantel. Eleanor recovered first, smoothing the air with a practiced smile. "You must have misunderstood. Your father was explaining some preliminary ideas. Nothing was decided." "Please don't lie to me," I said quietly. "You smiled when you realized I heard. You weren't surprised. You were relieved." The color drained from her face, but she didn't speak. My father leaned back, eyes narrowing, as if measuring how much ground he'd lost. "What exactly are those folders?" I slid one toward him. "Documentation. Every transfer I've made to the family account since college. $47,832. Records of my grandmother's inheritance, $8,000 withdrawn without permission. And loan guarantees signed in my name that I never saw." Alexandra's brow furrowed. "What do you mean, guarantees? Your father listed her as collateral on business loans," I said, turning to my sister. "He used my credit to secure them." My father's face went red, the flush that came when anger met embarrassment. "Everything I've done was for this family," he said. "To keep our lifestyle, to give you girls opportunities." "For Alexandra," I corrected. My voice stayed calm, which seemed to unsettle him more than shouting would have. "You funded her businesses, her apartments, her travel. You called it support. For me, you called it independence." Alexandra's hands tightened around her mug. "I didn't know," she said. "You didn't ask," I replied. "You didn't need to. The world was already built for you." The room felt smaller, the air sharper. My mother finally spoke, the tremor in her voice, more irritation than remorse. "You would take legal action against your own family after everything we've done for you." "What exactly have you done for me?" I asked, still soft. "Other than use my stability to fund your image." No one answered. The clock struck 9. Outside, the rain had slowed to mist. "I've closed all shared accounts," I said. "Canceled transfers. Reported the forged documents to legal counsel. You'll receive formal notice by next week." My father's chair scraped the floor. "You can't just walk away. Those accounts are tied to the company. We built plans around that structure." "Then you should have considered that before deciding I wasn't part of the future," I said. The quiet that followed was longer this time, heavy with recognition. They understood I meant every word. My mother turned to Alexandra, desperate. "Say something to your sister. Make her see reason." Alexandra looked, torn eyes flicking between our parents and me. "Is it true?" she asked. "About the business, about the loans." My father didn't answer. The silence confirmed what she needed to know. You've been playing us against each other our whole lives, she whispered, voice cracking. Making me the favorite so she'd keep trying to earn your approval. Keeping her close enough to use but never close enough to love. My father's hand slammed the table. That's enough. No, she said, rising. It's not. She opened the folder I'd placed before her, scanning the numbers with trembling fingers. You took her money, Dad. You borrowed from Grandma's account. You used her credit. His anger drained, leaving only exhaustion. The business hit trouble, he muttered. Permits delayed, investors nervous. It was temporary. I met his eyes. How bad is it? He hesitated, then looked down. The West Side project's over budget. We're 6 months behind schedule. Loans are due next quarter. You could have asked me for help, I said quietly. Professionally, that's what I do. He looked up sharply. And admit to you that I failed. There it was, the truth he could never tolerate. Pride had cost him everything, and he was still clinging to the pieces. I stood, sliding my chair back. I'm leaving. I booked an early flight to Chicago. My mother rose, 2 tears welling, but eyes still sharp. You would abandon us. What kind of daughter does that? The kind you raised, I said. Independent, practical, careful about where she invests her trust. I picked up my suitcase from the foyer. The house looked the same, but I could feel the edges crumbling beneath the polish. Alexandra stood by the table, her face pale, her voice low. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't see it. I thought they were just proud of me. You don't have to apologize, I told her. We were both just playing the parts they wrote for us. Behind us, my father called out, the panic finally catching up to his tone. Deirdre, wait. We can change things. Rewrite the will. Fix this. I turned in the doorway, the rain light behind me, the hall glowing like an old photograph. No, I said. You made your choice a long time ago. I'm just making mine. The door closed softly. No slam, no echo. Just the quiet click of a lock sliding into place, final measured and absolute. Outside, the air smelled of wet cedar and freedom. The cab pulled up at the curb, headlights diffused in the mist. As I climbed in, the house behind me blurred through the rain. For the first time, I didn't look back to see who was watching from the window. The road wound down the hill past the manicured lawns and gated drives, each one a monument to appearances. My phone buzzed a message from Michael. Are you safe? I stared at it for a long moment before answering. Yes. Finally. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, but said nothing. The rain eased to drizzle, then stopped altogether, leaving the street shining under the early light. I leaned my head against the cool glass, watching the city fall away. For years, I had measured my worth in silence and effort, in how much I could give without complaint. Now the numbers were different. $47,000 reclaimed, $8,000 stolen, repaid in truth, if not in cash. One life fully owned. When the plane lifted off 2 hours later, the sky opened above the clouds, clear and vast. I closed my eyes, letting the hum of the engines settle into rhythm with my heartbeat. The past was still behind me, but it was losing altitude fast. Somewhere below that perfect colonial house stood quiet, waiting for another storm. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one holding it up. The flight home to Chicago felt longer than usual, though the seatbelt light had barely turned off before I opened my laptop and began typing. The numbers and names filled the screen like familiar soldiers' calculations, dates, evidence. For most of my life, I had used spreadsheets to create order out of chaos. This time, I was building a wall. Outside the airplane window, the clouds drifted in soft gray layers. Below them, Was the world I was re-entering a city of tall glass buildings, hard edges, and quiet second chances? The rhythm of the engines steadied me. For the first time in years, I wasn't traveling towards someone else's expectations. I was returning to my own life. When the plane landed, I powered off my computer and exhaled slowly. My hands trembled a little, not from fear, but from the weight of everything that had finally shifted. The moment my shoes touched the ground, the familiar scent of jet fuel and concrete steadied me like an old truth. I was free, but freedom carries work. Michael was waiting near the arrivals gate, his jacket folded over one arm, his expression searching. He didn't speak right away. He just took my bag and rested a hand at the small of my back. That simple gesture said more than any sympathy could. "Let's go home," he said softly. In the car, the city glowed against a light rain. Streetlights stretched long reflections across the wet pavement, and people hurried beneath umbrellas. Life moved forward, indifferent but constant. Michael kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting near mine on the console. "Did you tell them everything?" he asked quietly. "I told them enough," I said. "They know I'm done. That's all they needed to hear." He nodded once, not pressing for details. The wipers clicked in rhythm, clearing the windshield again and again, the way time clears pain, if you let it. When we reached my apartment, the air inside felt different, lighter, sharper. I set my suitcase by the door and stood for a long moment just listening to the stillness. The soft hum of the refrigerator. The low tick of the thermostat. Silence that belonged entirely to me. Michael made tea and sat across from me at the kitchen island. The steam curled between us. "You look calmer than I expected," he said. "I think I used up all my anger on the way to the airport," I replied. "What's left is just clarity." He smiled faintly. "Clarity suits you." I looked around the small apartment, the framed certifications on the wall, the plants that somehow stayed alive despite my absences, the faint scent of cedar from the candle. I always forgot to blow out completely. Every item here had been earned by my own choices. I realized that even before this weekend, I had been building my escape without knowing it. The following week, I went back to work as if nothing monumental had happened, though my colleagues noticed something quieter in me. There's a difference between confidence and relief, and people can feel it even when you don't speak of it. On Wednesday, I met with my firm's legal department to formalize everything: fraud reports, revocation letters, notarized statements. The conference room smelled faintly of paper and lemon cleaner. The attorney assigned to me, a calm woman named Rebecca Ortiz, reviewed my documents with the kind of steady patience that only comes from years of sorting out other people's damage. "You did everything right," she said when we finished. "You kept records, you documented transfers, you'll be fine." "I'm not worried about being fine," I said. "I just don't want them to be able to reach into my life again." She closed the file gently. "Then they won't." Leaving her office, I felt an odd mixture of exhaustion and relief, like someone stepping off a long bridge and realizing the ground still holds. That night, I sat by the window with my grandmother's old notebook in my lap. The leather cover was worn smooth at the corners, the edges soft from her hands. Inside were pages of neat columns and small notes in her careful handwriting. Interest calculations, grocery lists, phrases like freedom begins with numbers. I ran my thumb along the ink, wondering what she would think of the woman I'd become. By Friday, the first email from my mother arrived. The subject line was blank. The body read, "We're worried about you. Please call. Families make mistakes. We can talk." I stared at the screen for a long while, feeling nothing. Then I archived the message. 2 days later, my father tried his version shorter, colder, more direct. We can adjust the trust structure if that will satisfy you. Let's discuss terms. There it was again, negotiation instead of apology. I didn't reply. When I told Michael about it, he didn't offer advice. He just reached across the couch and rested his hand over mine. "They'll keep trying until you stop answering," he said. "I already have," he smiled. "Then you're ahead of them." We spent the weekend driving north out of the city past the long sweep of Lake Michigan until the horizon disappeared into water and fog. The shoreline smelled of pine and salt wind. We walked without talking, and for the first time in months, I felt my body move without tension. The world didn't end because I said no. That evening, we sat by a small fire outside the cabin we'd rented. The wood cracked softly. The smoke curled up into the cold. "You know," I said after a while, "I always thought independence meant working twice as hard to prove I didn't need anyone. Now I think it means knowing when someone isn't good for you, even if they share your blood." Michael stirred the embers with a stick. "That's the kind of strength that doesn't show up on paper," he said. I nodded, watching sparks drift up and vanish into the night. Back in Chicago, my parents' silence lasted a week. Then the phone calls began, voicemails from my mother, filled with trembling pauses, messages from my father cloaked as business updates. I saved none of them. I'd already decided that acknowledgement without change was just another form of manipulation. Then, unexpectedly, a text arrived from Alexandra. Her words were hesitant, almost shy. "I don't know if you want to hear from me, but I need to say, I'm sorry." I read it 3 times before replying. "I don't hate you," I wrote, "but I need time." Her response came quickly. "Take all you need. I'm trying to figure out who I am without them telling me." For the first time, I believed her. The next few months passed quietly. I focused on work, on the daily discipline of building what I could control. My firm offered a promotion, a senior management role at the Boston office. The timing felt like alignment, not escape. When I told Michael, he simply said Boston's a good city for fresh starts. We moved in early spring. The apartment overlooked the Charles River, where the water caught sunlight like broken glass. I furnished it slowly, oak bookshelves, linen curtains, a desk by the window. The first box I unpacked held my grandmother's photo, her smile faint and steady. I placed it on the shelf where the light reached every morning. Some nights I still dreamt of the house in Portland, the echo of footsteps in long hallways, my mother's perfume drifting through rooms that never felt like mine. But each time I woke, the memory faded a little further, replaced by the hum of the city and the steady heartbeat beside me. One evening after work, as I was preparing dinner, Michael leaned against the counter and said, "You know, it's been almost 6 months since what I asked. Since you closed that door." I paused, the knife still in my hand, then smiled faintly. "It doesn't feel like closure. It feels like foundation." He nodded. "That's even better." Outside, the city lights shimmered on the river, and somewhere below, a boat horn sounded across the water. It wasn't loud, but it was certain steady and unhurried. Later that night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, thinking about the word foundation. My grandmother had used it often when teaching me about finance. A house stands only if the ground beneath it holds. You can't fix the roof until you trust the soil. The soil I came from had been cracked and shallow. But here, in the quiet hum of this new life, I could feel something different settling beneath me, solid earned and fully mine. I finished my tea and set the cup down, watching the moon reflect across the dark water. For the first time, the thought of my family didn't stir anger or ache. It just reminded me how far I'd come. Tomorrow, I would wake early, go for a run along the river, and then walk into an office where people respected the work I did. My name was on the door now. My grandmother's lessons were in the air I breathed. And though part of me still carried the shadow of that house, it no longer defined the shape of my life. The rain started again outside, soft against the glass, a rhythm I'd known all my life. But here it didn't sound like sorrow. It sounded like renewal, like the earth being quietly washed clean, ready for something new to grow. Spring came early that year. The snow along the Charles melted into silver streams that ran toward the river, and the city seemed to exhale after holding its breath all winter. From my office window, I could see the water shifting from gray to blue, the surface broken only by the glide of early rowers. I'd grown used to that rhythm, the steady pull of oars, the pause, the glide again. It mirrored the slow balance I'd been rebuilding in my own life. Work filled my days, but not the way it used to. Before, success had been a defense proof that I was worth something to people who refused to see it. Now it was simply what I did well. The satisfaction came from order, not approval. Even so, some evenings I would find myself sitting in the quiet apartment, tea cooling beside me, thinking about the empty places I had left behind. One Thursday in late April, my phone lit up with a number I hadn't seen in months. For a moment, I almost ignored it. Then something in me decided that silence, too, could become a kind of cage. Alexandra's voice came through, hesitant but steady. "I hope this isn't a bad time." "It's fine," I said. "I've been wanting to call for a while. I just didn't know how." There was a long pause before she continued. "I'm working now. A real job. Assistant designer for a sustainable clothing line in Portland. It's small, but they liked my portfolio." I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "That's good, Alex. Really good." She laughed softly. "It feels strange earning my own money. Harder, but cleaner. I wanted to tell you that I understand now what you meant about independence not being punishment." I leaned back in my chair, watching light flicker off the river. "I'm proud of you," I said simply. Her voice wavered a little. "They don't make it easy, you know. Mom calls every few days to talk about investors. Dad still pretends everything's fine. But I'm keeping my distance. That's harder than it sounds," I said. "It is," she agreed. "But I'm trying." When the call ended, I sat for a long while in the quiet, the kind that doesn't feel empty, but expectant. Alexandra's words lingered like the first warm wind of the season, soft, but real. Weeks passed, and our calls became more frequent. Small things, at first recipe stories from her office, occasional memories we could finally laugh about without bitterness. There was still caution in her tone, but underneath it, a kind of rebuilding. We were learning how to be sisters without our parents' choreography guiding every step. One evening, she called, sounding unsettled. "Dad's business filed for bankruptcy today," she said. "Mom told me just now. They didn't even warn me." I felt a strange stillness settle in my chest. "How are you taking it?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me feels terrible for them. The other part knows this was coming." "It was," I said quietly. "They built everything on image. That's not a strong foundation. Mom keeps saying it's temporary, that they'll recover. But they're selling the house." The news hit harder than I expected. That house had been more symbol than home, but symbols still hold weight. I pictured the porch lights, the polished floors, the walls that had absorbed so many unspoken things. For all its coldness, it was the place where I'd learned to stand my ground. "I guess every kingdom has an ending," Alexandra said softly. "Maybe it's not an ending," I told her. "Maybe it's a correction." She didn't answer right away. "Do you ever think they'll see what they did I used to?" I said. "Now I think understanding might be beyond them, but accountability isn't." After we hung up, I sat by the window watching the city lights ripple across the water. For years, I had carried the image of my parents as towering figures, unmovable, self-assured. Hearing about their fall didn't bring satisfaction, just closure, the kind that arrives not with applause, but with quiet inevitability. In May, my firm sponsored a charity event for women in finance. I was asked to speak about personal growth in a male-dominated industry. The irony wasn't lost on me. As I stepped onto the small stage, the microphone cool against my palm, I felt the weight of my grandmother's lessons pressing gently behind me. I spoke about integrity, about resilience, and about knowing when to stop fighting for validation that was never going to come. When the applause faded, a young woman approached me in the lobby. She looked barely out of college, nervous, but bright-eyed. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "What you said about walking away, it reminded me that leaving doesn't mean losing." Her words stayed with me long after she left. That night, I pulled out my grandmother's notebook again and wrote across a blank page, "Teach what you know. Give what you needed." By June, the idea had become something real, a mentorship program for young women learning financial independence. I named it the Martha Sawyer Foundation. The first meetings were small, held in a borrowed conference room with fluorescent lighting and a pot of burnt coffee. But every time I spoke, I saw a reflection of my younger self in their eyes, hungry for permission to believe in their own worth. One afternoon, Alexandra sent flowers to the office, a mix of white lilies and green ferns. The card read, "For Grandma, for you, for every girl who deserves better." I kept the card on my desk. A few months later, Alexandra visited Boston for a design expo. When she walked into my apartment, she looked different, lighter somehow. She stood by the window, taking in the view. "You did it," she said softly. "You built a life that's yours." "So did you?" I told her. She smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Mom and Dad asked if I'd visit with them while I'm here. I said no. I'm not ready for that." "That's okay," I said. "Boundaries don't mean hatred. They mean honesty." We talked late into the night, sitting on the floor with cups of chamomile tea, the city glowing beyond the glass. There was laughter, and the kind of silence that felt easy for once. Before she left the next morning, she hugged me tightly. "You know," she whispered, "I used to think you were the unlucky one. Now I realize you were just free first." When the door closed behind her, I stood there a while, hands still warm from her embrace. Her words echoed softly, not as a compliment, but as a truth earned through years of imbalance. Summer rolled in slowly. The foundation gained traction, local papers running small pieces about its mission. The work filled my days, but the fulfillment came quietly, like a tide that doesn't need an audience. In the evenings, Michael and I would walk along the harbor, the air thick with the scent of salt and grilled food from waterfront cafes. We spoke about the future in the kind of calm voices used by people who have survived enough storms to appreciate clear skies. Then one morning, an envelope arrived in the mail with my father's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. The slanted, business-like script that had once signed my report cards, my first car loan, the documents that tied me to his mistakes. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "We've lost the house. Your mother's living with her sister for now. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I'm proud of what you've built. Take care of your sister. Dad." There was no return address. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and slid it into my grandmother's notebook. Not as a keepsake, but as proof that even the proud can learn humility, however late. That night, I told Michael about the letter. He listened without interrupting, then said, "Does it change anything?" "No," I said, "but it settles something." We sat together in the quiet, the windows open to the sound of the harbor below. The air smelled of rain and salt. For the first time, my thoughts about my parents didn't feel heavy. They just felt distant, like a story I'd once been part of, but no longer belonged to. Before bed, I walked to the shelf where my grandmother's photo stood. The light from the city flickered across her face, soft and sure. "You were right," I whispered. "Financial independence really is freedom. But it's more than money, it's peace." The clock on the wall ticked steadily each second, marking another quiet distance from the life I'd left behind. Tomorrow would bring work decisions, ordinary hours. But beneath it all ran a calm I hadn't known before, a current of something steady and real. And in that stillness, I realized the truest revenge was not triumph or apology. It was the life I was already living, earned whole, and finally free. The night after I tucked my father's letter into my grandmother's notebook, the city was unusually still. The harbor lights flickered across the ceiling in soft gold bands, and the window pane trembled with the rhythm of the wind. Beside me, Michael slept with one hand resting loosely over my arm, the quiet of his breathing grounding me in the kind of safety I used to only imagine. Outside, Boston breathed a living thing of motion and sound, but here in this small corner of it, there was peace. Morning came, pale and cool. The streets below were wet from rain, glistening like metal under the early light. I poured coffee and stood by the window, the cup warming my hands as the city stirred awake. There was something almost holy about the quiet that comes after a storm, the space between what broke and what healed. I realized I was standing in that space now. A week later, Alexandra called again. Her voice carried the hum of movement behind its city traffic, the echo of footsteps. "I found a studio apartment," she said. "Small, but it's mine. I can afford it on my own salary." "That's wonderful," I said, meaning it. "Does it feel strange?" She laughed softly, like standing on new ground. "Scary, but solid." "I know that feeling," I told her. Her tone shifted quieter now. "I'm visiting Grandma's grave this weekend. I wanted to say thank you to you for showing me what independence really means." I looked out across the harbor, the sunlight sharp and white on the water. "Tell her I listened," I said. "That I finally understood what she meant about freedom being responsibility." "I will," she whispered. "And Deirdre, I'm proud of you." It was a simple sentence, but it landed like the closing of an old wound. When the call ended, I set the phone down and let the quiet fill the room again. For years, silence had meant exclusion. Now it was choice space to breathe, to think, to rest. By late summer, the Martha Sawyer Foundation had grown beyond its modest beginnings. We partnered with a local community college to host free workshops for women learning to manage their own finances. Single mothers, young professionals, retirees starting over. I spoke at the first session in a sunlit lecture hall that smelled faintly of chalk and coffee. The women listened with the kind of attention I once reserved for my grandmother at her kitchen table. I told them how she taught me to read numbers as language, to see budgets not as restrictions, but as maps to freedom. Their eyes followed each word with quiet understanding, and I could feel something shifting in the room. Not awe, but recognition. Afterward, a woman about my mother's age approached me. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her glasses. "I thought I was too old to start again," she said, her voice thick. "But hearing you speak made me think maybe I'm not." "You're not," I said gently. "It's never too late to own your life." She nodded, and for a brief moment, I saw in her the face of every woman who had ever been told she was too much or not enough. I knew then that my grandmother's wisdom had come full circle. That evening, Michael and I walked along the harbor after the event. The air smelled of salt and grilled food drifting from the piers. He slipped his hand into mine. "You looked calm up there," he said, "like you belonged in that moment." "I think I did," I said. It felt less like telling my story and more like closing it. He smiled. "Maybe it's not closing. Maybe it's just settling into its shape." We watched the boats move slowly toward open water, the sun dipping low, turning everything gold. I thought of my parents somewhere out west, living quietly in the shadow of their choices. I no longer needed to know the details. Some distances are meant to stay steady. A month later, Alexandra sent a photo. She stood in her new apartment, surrounded by bolts of fabric and sunlight. Behind her, pinned to the wall, was a handwritten sign: "Build what you wish had existed for you." It looked like something she might have found in a thrift shop, but the handwriting was hers. I saved the image to my phone, not for sentiment, but for what it represented: two women from the same broken home, learning to build different kinds of strength. On the anniversary of my grandmother's passing, I visited her grave for the first time since leaving Portland. The cemetery sat on a quiet hill, overlooking the city rows of headstones, leaning slightly with age. I brought white tulips, her favorite, and laid them carefully at the base of her stone. The air was cool, the kind of soft gray light that feels like memory. I sat on the grass and told her everything about Boston, about the foundation, about Alexandra finally learning how to stand without help. I spoke aloud until the wind picked up, carrying my words down the hill and out of hearing, as if they'd been received. When I stood, the ground beneath my shoes felt steady and dry. I brushed the dirt from my palms and looked toward the horizon, where a line of sun was breaking through the clouds. Driving back into the city, I realized something simple but profound. Peace doesn't arrive like a wave crashing in. It builds slowly, one clear decision at a time, until one day you look around and realize it's already there. That night, I lit a single candle on the windowsill and opened the notebook again. I added a final page beneath my grandmother's handwriting, a list of what I had learned, not about money, but about worth. Independence is not loneliness. Generosity without self-respect is surrender. And sometimes, the kindest goodbye is the one that stays quiet. When I closed the book, the candle's flame wavered and steadied again, its glow soft against the glass. Michael came from the kitchen. His sleeves rolled, the smell of roasted garlic following him. "Dinner's ready," he said. I smiled, closing the notebook gently. "I'm coming." We ate by the window, the city shimmering beyond us, the candle still burning low. Outside, the harbor reflected the evening light, blue fading into gold, then into silver. I thought about everything that had unraveled to bring me here. Every silence, every disappointment, every moment that had once felt unbearable. They had all carved the shape of this peace. Later, as I stepped out onto the balcony, the air carried the faint scent of salt and rain. I leaned on the railing and let the night surround me. The city moved softly below headlights, gliding like quiet constellations across the streets. Somewhere in that hum of life, I felt the echo of my grandmother's voice, steady, kind, reminding me that freedom was never about leaving people behind, but about returning to yourself. I stayed there until the candlelight flickered out behind the window, the last trace of its glow mirrored on the glass. The sky deepened into indigo, and the stars began to appear one by one, measured, patient, unhurried. Peace, I realized, isn't the end of the story. It's what allows you to begin again, without fear. If this story found you when you needed it, tell me where you're listening from. And if you've ever had to rebuild your peace from the ground up, know that you're not alone. Take a breath, hold your ground, and when the time comes, walk toward your own calm. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who's learning that lesson too.